The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood as birds chirped softly in the background. A lone figure stood outside his modest car, his breath visible in the crisp air. He had just finished his night shift at the hospital, a grueling 12 hours filled with emergency cases, endless paperwork, and the heavy responsibility of patient care. Exhausted but relieved to finally head home, he fished his keys from his pocket and unlocked the door. Before he could settle into the driver's seat, the sound of a distant engine grew louder, followed by the sharp chirp of a police siren. Startled, he froze mid-motion, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? The patrol car pulled up behind his vehicle, its red and blue lights flashing insistently, even though the street was otherwise empty. A voice crackled over the car's speaker. "Step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." Confused and slightly unnerved, he complied, raising his hands as he backed away from his own car. The officer exited the squad car, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his hip. His expression was stern, his eyes scanning the man's every move. "What's going on, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with unease. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he circled the car, his gaze darting between the vehicle and the man standing a few feet away. "We got a report of a suspicious individual tampering with a vehicle in this area," the officer finally said. "Do you have any identification?" The man blinked, caught off guard by the accusation. "This is my car," he replied, gesturing toward the vehicle. "I'm just trying to get home after work." The officer's eyebrows raised slightly, his skepticism evident. "Your car, mind explaining why someone called it in as stolen?" He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, his mind racing. Who would report his car as stolen? He'd had it for years, worked hard to pay it off, and never had any issues like this before. The situation was surreal, and the officer's unrelenting gaze only made it worse. "I don't know why anyone would say that," he said carefully, trying to keep his tone even. "But I can show you the registration and my license. Everything's in the glove compartment." The officer hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Slowly," he instructed, his hand never leaving his weapon. With deliberate movements, he walked back to the car and opened the passenger door, his every motion under scrutiny. Retrieving the documents, he handed them over, his pulse quickening as he waited for the officer's reaction. The officer examined the papers in silence, his brow furrowing. "These could belong to anyone," he said after a moment, his tone accusatory. The man's frustration began to simmer beneath the surface. "They belong to me," he insisted, though he kept his voice calm. "Look at the picture on my license. It's me." The officer glanced between the ID and the man standing before him, his expression unreadable. "Stay right here," he ordered, returning to his patrol car. Minutes felt like hours as the man stood by the curb, the chill of the morning air doing little to cool his rising anxiety. Passers-by began to slow down, some craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding scene. It wasn't long before the familiar sensation of being judged, questioned, and underestimated began to creep in. When the officer finally returned, his expression was as stern as before. "The paperwork checks out," he admitted grudgingly. "But I'm still going to need to verify this with the station." "Protocol." The man clenched his jaw, the tension in his body mounting. "Protocol. I've already shown you proof. What more do you need?" "Sir," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I'm just doing my job. We need to be sure everything is above board. You'd want the same if it were your property." The man took a deep breath, knowing that escalating the situation would only make things worse. "Fine," he said, crossing his arms. "But this is ridiculous." As the officer returned to his car to make the call, a new figure entered the scene. A neighbor from across the street, phone in hand and concern etched on their face. "Hey," they called out, approaching cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" Before the man could respond, the officer cut in. "Ma'am, please step back. We're handling the situation. The neighbor's eyes darted between the officer and the man, their frown deepening. He lives here, they said firmly. I see him every day. That's his car. The officer hesitated, the weight of the neighbor's words creating an uneasy pause. We've received a report, he said, his tone defensive. I need to do my due diligence. But the neighbor wasn't backing down. This doesn't feel like due diligence, they said, their voice rising slightly. This feels like harassment. The tension in the air was palpable now, drawing the attention of more neighbors peeking out from their windows or stepping onto their porches. Whispers began to ripple through the small crowd, their murmurs amplifying the pressure on the officer. Still, he remained resolute. Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me finish my work. The man watched the exchange silently, his frustration giving way to a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He wasn't sure whether the neighbor's intervention would help or make things worse, but he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. The officer returned to his patrol car once more, this time staying longer as he spoke into his radio. The man used the moment of respite to address the neighbor. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and appreciation. The neighbor nodded. This isn't right, they said simply. When the officer finally emerged from the car again, his expression was unreadable. He approached the man with slow, deliberate steps, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Then, without warning, he did something that left everyone watching in stunned silence. The officer took a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as if weighing an invisible burden. The street was quiet now, the only sounds the distant hum of morning traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The tension was thick, wrapping around everyone like a heavy fog. The man clenched his fists at his sides, bracing himself for whatever came next. The officer extended his hand, holding the license between two fingers. You can have this back, he said, his voice unusually neutral. But there was something in his expression, a flicker of hesitation, like he was second-guessing himself. The man took the ID without a word, stuffing it back into his wallet. You said you work at the hospital, the officer asked, glancing toward the car again. Yeah, the man replied, keeping his tone even. I just finished a 12-hour shift. I'm tired, and I just want to go home. The officer nodded slightly, as if registering the exhaustion in his voice for the first time. He still didn't step away from the car, though. He lingered, studying the man's face, as if looking for something. The neighbor was still nearby, arms crossed, their expression tight with frustration. What exactly is the issue here? They asked, eyes locked onto the officer. He's shown you proof. He's lived here for years. Why are we still standing here? The officer let out a slow breath and finally took a step back. The report was made anonymously, he said, directing the words to both of them. Someone claimed this car was being stolen. I had to follow protocol. The neighbor scoffed. Anonymous, huh? And I bet that caller just happened to be watching from behind a curtain, waiting for you to show up. The man stayed quiet, his mind racing. Who would have called this in? He had neighbors he spoke to, coworkers who knew his routine. No one had ever questioned whether this was his car before. The officer shifted on his feet. He seemed to realize how ridiculous the situation looked, especially now with a small audience watching. Still, he wasn't backing down completely. Do you know if anyone has had an issue with you recently? He asked. The question caught him off guard. He frowned. No, I keep to myself, go to work, come home. That's it. The officer studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his patrol car. The tension in the air remained thick, no one willing to move just yet. The man exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. His exhaustion had been replaced with something else now. Unease, confusion. This wasn't just a random misunderstanding. Someone had reported his car stolen. Someone had watched him, waited for the right moment to make that call. The officer sat in his patrol car for a while, flipping through something on his dashboard screen. The man could feel the neighbor's eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. "Are you okay?" they finally asked. He nodded, but the answer didn't feel right. A few minutes later, the officer stepped out again, this time without the stiff posture of before. He looked at the man, then at the small crowd that had gathered. "I'm going to file this as a misunderstanding," he said. "But if anything else happens, if you notice anything suspicious, you should report it." The man narrowed his eyes. "Suspicious like what?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "Just anything unusual." And with that, he returned to his car and drove off, leaving behind more questions than answers. The neighbor let out a frustrated sigh, shaking their head. "That was unbelievable," they muttered. The man nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. His gut told him this wasn't over. Someone had made that call. Someone wanted him to be in that situation. And now, as he watched the patrol car disappear down the street, he had a new problem to solve. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he felt. The officer's words lingered in his head. "If you notice anything suspicious, report it." Suspicious like what? He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet someone had gone out of their way to make it seem like he had. By morning, the feeling hadn't gone away. As he got ready for work, he found himself checking the windows, glancing outside more often than usual. Everything looked normal. The street was quiet, just like it always was, but something about it felt different now, like an invisible presence was watching. At the hospital, he tried to shake it off, focusing on his patients, on the steady rhythm of his work. But even there, something was off. One of his coworkers gave him a strange look in the break room. Another hesitated before saying good morning. He told himself it was nothing, just his own paranoia creeping in. Then, during lunch, his phone buzzed with a notification. A message from an unknown number. "Watch yourself." His fingers tightened around the phone. His stomach twisted. He stared at the message, reading it over and over, hoping he had imagined it. But the words were right there, clear as day. Someone was trying to scare him. He glanced around the room, but no one was paying him any attention. His heart pounded in his chest. He could ignore it, pretend it was a prank, but after what had happened the day before, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected. By the time his shift ended, the paranoia had turned into something heavier, something that sat in his chest like a weight. He walked to his car slowly, scanning the parking lot, searching for anything out of place. It was quiet. Too quiet. Then he saw it. A car, parked at the far end of the lot. Its engine wasn't running, but he could see the silhouette of someone sitting inside, watching. His throat went dry. His mind raced. Was this the person who had called the police? The person who had sent the message? His first instinct was to leave, to drive home and lock the door behind him. But something inside him refused to run. Instead, he took out his phone and snapped a quick picture of the car. The second he did, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle peeled out of the lot, speeding away before he could even think about getting a license plate number. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, staring at the now empty parking space. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was deliberate. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched. That night, he double-checked every lock in his house. He pulled the curtains shut, left a light on in the living room, and sat awake on the couch, phone in hand. He debated calling the police, but what would he even say? Someone sent me a vague message and then watched me from their car. They'd probably tell him there wasn't enough to go on. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally won. He fell asleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing against the table. Another message. That was a mistake. His breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the words. A mistake. Taking the picture. A mistake for who? His pulse hammered in his ears. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He had to find out who was behind this. The next day, he called out of work. He didn't want to leave his house, but he also didn't want to sit there doing nothing. If someone wanted to scare him, they'd already done a good job. Now it was his turn to find answers. He started with the neighborhood. He went door to door, talking to the people he'd known for years, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. Most people shook their heads, offering sympathetic looks but little else. Then he reached the house on the corner. The woman who lived there was always outside, always paying attention to what was going on. "Actually," she said, frowning, "I did see something the other night. A car parked near your place, just sitting there for a long time. Thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it." His chest tightened. "Did you see who was inside?" She shook her head. "Too dark, but they weren't from around here. That's for sure." He thanked her and walked away, his mind spinning. It was real. He wasn't imagining things. Someone had been watching him. That night, he parked his car a block away and walked home on foot, moving quietly, staying in the shadows. He wanted to see if the car would come back, if whoever was behind this would show up again. For hours, nothing happened. The street was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of cars on the highway. Then, just past midnight, a car rolled down the street, its headlights off. His breath caught. He pressed himself against the wall of a nearby building, watching as the vehicle slowed near his house. The driver didn't get out, didn't even roll down the window. Just sat there, engine running. His heart pounded. He took out his phone, started recording. This time, he wasn't going to let them get away. But then, as if sensing they were being watched, the car suddenly sped off, disappearing around the corner. He exhaled shakily, staring at the empty street. Whoever they were, they weren't done yet. And now, neither was he. The next few days felt like an eternity. Each morning, he awoke with the same knot of anxiety in his stomach, that nagging feeling that someone was still watching. Every time he stepped outside, he found himself looking over his shoulder, wondering if he was being followed. The car hadn't appeared again, but that didn't bring him any relief. The silence was even worse, like the calm before the storm. But then, the messages started coming more frequently. "You can't hide forever. We know everything about you. You're running out of time." Each message sent a chill down his spine, twisting his insides with a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. Whoever was doing this was getting bolder. He had always believed that if he kept his head down, if he didn't engage with whatever this was, it would eventually go away. But now he realized that wasn't an option anymore. He couldn't avoid it any longer. It was on the 5th day after the last incident, when he was coming back from the grocery store, that things took another unexpected turn. His car was gone. For a moment, he stood frozen on the sidewalk, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The empty parking space where his car had been was now just an abandoned stretch of pavement. Panic surged through him, and he rushed to the spot, checking both sides of the street, as if hoping the car would suddenly reappear. It didn't. His breath quickened as he pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the local police. The officer who had questioned him before answered after 2 rings. "Is this about the car again?" The officer's voice was weary, like he'd been expecting this. "Yes," he replied, his words rushing out. "It's gone. Someone stole it. I don't know who or why, but I need help." There was a long pause before the officer spoke again. "I'll send someone out to file a report, but you might want to check your camera footage first." He blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The cameras in your area. You've got security cameras, right?" He hadn't thought of that. In his rush to get inside, he hadn't even noticed the camera above his porch. The same camera that had captured the strange car earlier. "I'll check it now," he said, his voice tight. He hung up and hurried inside, rushing to his computer. His fingers trembled as he logged into the security system. The footage was there, time-stamped and ready to be viewed. He scrolled back, his eyes scanning the footage from the night before. The camera's view showed the street outside, the same as always, until the car appeared again. But this time, something was different. The vehicle didn't just stop near his house. It pulled into the driveway. And there in the moonlight, a figure emerged from the shadows. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was someone he recognized. His heart sank as he watched the person approach his car, pulling something out of their pocket, a key. His mind raced as he tried to process the footage. This person was using a spare key to open his car door. The person was no stranger. It was someone from his neighborhood, someone he had spoken to many times, someone who had always seemed kind and normal. No, it couldn't be. He was imagining things. But the footage didn't lie. The figure stepped into the car, started the engine, and drove off. His car was gone, stolen, by someone he knew. The shock of it hit him like a physical blow. His mind couldn't make sense of it. Why? Why would they do this? Was it revenge for something he hadn't even realized? Or was there more to this than just petty theft? He sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, the silence in the room suffocating. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to think. This wasn't just about the car anymore. This was personal. Someone had been watching him, tracking his every move, and now they had taken something from him. Something valuable, something irreplaceable. He quickly saved the footage and called the police again, his voice strained with a new urgency. I need to file a report. My car's been stolen. And I know who took it. When the officer arrived, the situation took an even stranger turn. The officer watched the footage and listened to his account, but instead of reacting with shock or disbelief, he remained calm, almost too calm. Are you sure about this? The officer asked, eyeing him with an odd expression. Of course I'm sure. I saw it with my own eyes. He replied, his voice hard. The officer nodded slowly. I'll take this to the station, but you should be aware that the person in the video. He stopped, glancing at the screen again. Is a known associate of the department. His blood ran cold. The officer's words felt like a slap in the face. What did that mean? Was this officer somehow involved? Was he part of the reason why this was all happening? He tried to control his breathing, but his chest felt tight, like the walls were closing in. The officer seemed to notice the tension, but didn't address it further. He simply stood up and left, telling him that they would look into it and get back to him. The man was left alone in the room, the weight of what he had just learned settling over him like a heavy blanket. The person who had taken his car wasn't just anyone. It was someone connected to the very system he had trusted to protect him. It wasn't just the car anymore. This was deeper. Someone had been using their power to manipulate the situation from the inside. He didn't know if it was for money, for revenge, or something else entirely, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to stop. And now he had no choice but to fight back. He wasn't sure how yet, but he knew one thing: he was done running. The hours that followed were a blur. He couldn't sit still. His thoughts were racing, tumbling over each other like a torrent. Someone from the police department had stolen his car, had been watching him, had manipulated the entire situation, and now they were trying to cover their tracks. He couldn't let this go. He knew the risks, but he wasn't about to let the truth slip away into the shadows. Not this time. He couldn't trust the officer who had already dismissed his concerns. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. He had to go directly to the source. His heart pounded as he made his decision. He knew the police station was where he had to start. He had to confront the person who had been in on it. He waited until the dead of night, when the station was quieter. The streets outside were nearly empty, a ghost town, with only the occasional car passing by. He parked his car a few blocks away and approached the station on foot, feeling the cool night air press against his skin, his nerves on edge. The building loomed ahead, dark and silent. The back door was his best option. Less traffic, less chance of running into anyone. He knew where the security cameras were, where the weak spots in the station's perimeter were. It didn't take long to slip inside unnoticed. Once inside, he made his way through the hallways, moving as quietly as possible. He had a single objective: find the officer who had been involved and get answers. He didn't care how. He couldn't afford to back down now. He rounded a corner and froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the officer, the one who had first questioned him about the car, the one who had acted so strangely when he found out the truth. The officer was talking to someone, a figure dressed in a dark coat, their back turned. But that wasn't what caught his attention. What stopped him cold was the sight of his car keys sitting on the desk in front of them, as if they were just another item to be shuffled through. His breath caught in his throat. He was so close to finding out who was behind this. But before he could move, the officer's voice cut through the air. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," the officer said, his voice low and strained. "He's not going to let it go." The other figure didn't respond immediately. Then, finally, they spoke. "He's already too deep. He knows too much. If we don't stop him, everything we've worked for will come crumbling down." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He was talking about the officer's involvement. But what did that mean? What were they hiding? He stepped closer, heart racing, trying to make sense of the conversation. He had to get closer, but the tension in the air was palpable. His steps were silent, but with every movement, the weight of the situation pressed harder against him. Suddenly, the officer turned, and for a moment, their eyes locked. The realization hit both of them at the same time. The man didn't wait for the officer to react. He bolted, running down the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stop," the officer shouted, his voice sharp, but the man didn't listen. His adrenaline surged, pushing him faster. He could hear footsteps behind him, but they weren't fast enough. He reached the back door, ripped it open, and ran into the night. He didn't stop until he reached his car. He fumbled for the keys, his fingers slick with sweat. Once inside, he locked the doors and started the engine, the roar of the car filling the silence around him. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. He was still processing what he had overheard. The officer wasn't just trying to scare him. They had been trying to protect their own secrets. But what secrets? Who else was involved in this conspiracy? Just as he was about to pull away, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the same unknown number. "You should have stayed out of it. Now if there's no turning back." He slammed the phone down onto the passenger seat, his stomach churning. He couldn't shake the feeling that the threat wasn't just aimed at him, it was aimed at everyone. He had uncovered something much larger than he had anticipated. He drove, trying to clear his head, but the more he thought about the situation, the more tangled it became. The officer, the stolen car, the messages, everything was connected, but he still didn't know how. It wasn't until he reached his home that the final twist of the night hit him. The moment he stepped out of the car, he felt it, a cold, chilling breeze that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced around the street, and that's when he saw it. His car. It was parked right in front of his house. The car that had been stolen. The car that had vanished without a trace. It was back. But this time, there was no one inside. He walked toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this some kind of message? Had the officer somehow returned it, trying to cover their tracks? Or was it someone else trying to make him think everything was over? He approached the car cautiously, his every step calculated. He opened the door. The interior was immaculate. Everything looked the same as it had when he last saw it. But there was something he hadn't noticed before, a small note wedged between the seat and the center console. He pulled it out with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The note was simple, but the words struck him like a lightning bolt. The truth was never in the car. It's always been closer than you think. His blood ran cold. The truth wasn't in the car. What did that mean? What was he missing? And just as he was about to process it, the sound of a car engine rumbled behind him. He turned around, only to find himself face to face with the officer, the one who had been involved in the cover-up. But this time, there was something different in the officer's eyes. A look of defeat, a look that said everything had changed. "It's over," the officer said quietly. "You're not going to win this, but at least now, you know the truth." And with those words, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Everything he had been chasing, all the answers he had been searching for, were standing right in front of him. The officer's words hung in the air like a thick fog. The truth was right in front of him, but it still didn't make sense. How could it all be over? He had spent so long searching for answers, and now here he was, facing someone who was a part of it all. Yet the pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit. "You're telling me the truth?" he asked, his voice tight, fighting to remain steady. "After everything that's happened, you're just going to tell me it's over?" The officer gave him a long, weary look, his eyes filled with something close to regret. "I wish it were that simple," the officer said quietly. "But it's never been about your car. It's about something bigger, something you weren't meant to see." A chill ran through him, and he felt the weight of the words sinking in. "What are you talking about?" The officer took a deep breath, looking around as if checking for someone. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's a network, an underground system that's been running for years. It's all connected to the way things are controlled. People in power, people like me, we've been keeping things in place, making sure things stay the way they are. Your car wasn't the end of the story. It was a message, a test to see if you could figure it out. And you did." He shook his head, still not understanding. "Why me? Why go after me?" The officer looked away, his expression hardening. "It wasn't personal. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You started asking questions no one wanted to answer, digging into things people had been hiding. But the car was never about you. It was a way to push you to the truth, to make you see the bigger picture." The weight of it all was suffocating. He had been chasing a mystery that wasn't just about a stolen car or a corrupt officer. It was about a much darker world behind the scenes, a world where people were controlled by unseen hands, a world where secrets were buried and manipulated for power. And now, here he was, standing face to face with someone who had played a part in keeping it all in place. "So, what happens now?" he asked, the words coming out like a whisper. "Is it just over?" The officer hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice quiet. "There's no going back. You've seen too much, and so have I. Things are going to change, whether we want them to or not. The question is, how will you move forward?" The man stood there, staring at the officer, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything he had just learned. His life had been turned upside down, and now the truth was right there, staring him in the face. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to get my car back." The officer gave a small, almost sad smile. "That's the thing. Sometimes the truth doesn't come in neat packages. Sometimes it's messy, and it takes us to places we never expected. But now you know what's really at play. You've seen the system, and you've seen the strings that are pulling everything. What you do with that knowledge, that's up to you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation pressed down on them, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city around them. Everything had changed. His world was no longer the same. He had learned the hard way that sometimes things weren't as simple as they seemed. There was more to life than what was visible on the surface, and the truth was often buried deep beneath layers of deception. Finally, the officer turned to walk away, but before he did, he glanced back one last time. "Just remember this," he said. "No matter what you do, the truth will always come back to you. And when it does, you'll have to decide what kind of person you want to be." The words echoed in his mind as the officer disappeared into the shadows. The man stood there, alone in the street, feeling the strange sense of closure settling over him. He had been through so much, and yet in some ways, it felt like he had just begun to understand the true depth of the situation. He looked down at the note in his hand once more. The words, "The truth was never in the car. It's always been closer than you think," still fresh in his mind. He had thought the car was the key, but now he understood. He was the key. His own curiosity, his own determination to uncover the truth, had led him down a path that no one could have predicted. It wasn't about the car, or the officer, or even the network that had tried to control everything. It was about him and his willingness to question everything, to search for answers no matter where they might lead. As he walked back to his house, he knew that his life would never be the same again. He wasn't just the victim of a crime. He had become part of something much larger. And though the answers were still elusive, one thing was clear. He was no longer willing to sit in the background, to remain silent. He had seen behind the curtain, and now he would make sure that everyone else saw it too. With each step, he realized that this was just the beginning. The truth was out there, and no matter how deep it was buried, he would keep digging until he uncovered every last secret. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the car. It was about the fight for justice, the battle against the hidden forces that controlled everything, and the unwavering will to make sure the truth was never buried again. The night air felt different now, charged with a new energy. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this time, he was ready for whatever came next. The man walked slowly back to his house, the cool night air brushing against his skin, but the weight of the last few hours felt heavier than ever. Everything had changed, and yet some things still didn't make sense. His car, the stolen one, had returned, and the officer's cryptic words about truth and power lingered in his mind. There was so much more to this than he had ever expected. He stepped into his home, the quiet, familiar surroundings doing little to ease the turmoil within him. His mind kept racing, replaying every moment of the encounter with the officer. What did he mean by "the truth will always come back to you"? What exactly was the officer warning him about? Was there a way out of this? Or had he just stumbled into something far bigger than himself? Sitting down at his kitchen table, he tried to make sense of it all. His eyes drifted to the car keys still resting on the table, the very keys that had caused this whirlwind of chaos. It had all started so simply. His car, a small personal loss. But now, everything was connected to something deeper, something systemic, a world of secrets and shadows. He couldn't shake the thought that his involvement wasn't a random occurrence, but something that had been orchestrated from the start. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. Someone he hadn't spoken to in weeks. A friend, someone he trusted. It was time to find answers, not just for himself, but for the people who might also be tangled in the same web. The phone rang a few times before the voice on the other end picked up. "Hello." He exhaled, feeling a small relief just from hearing the familiar voice. "I need your help." Over the next few days, he met with his friend, digging into every detail he could find about the network the officer had mentioned. It wasn't easy. There were so many dead ends, so many people trying to keep their secrets buried. But with each lead they followed, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. The network wasn't just about stolen cars or corrupt police officers. It was about manipulation, about using people's lives, their actions, their reputations, as pawns in a game played by those in power. The officer, it turned out, wasn't the only one involved. There were others in the department, in City Hall, even in local businesses. The connections ran deep, and the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that what he had stumbled upon wasn't just a conspiracy. It was the way things were run. But there was one thing that continued to haunt him, the officer's final words. "You'll have to decide what kind of person you want to be." It seemed like a simple statement, but it felt loaded with meaning. What did it really mean to be part of this fight? Was he supposed to expose the truth, risk everything to bring it to light? Or was he meant to let it go, to accept that sometimes the world was more complicated than he could ever understand? Days turned into weeks as he wrestled with these questions. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the truth kept pulling at him, drawing him back into the heart of the matter. There were too many people whose lives had been affected by the actions of those in power. Too many stories that had been hidden in the shadows, and he realized that he couldn't just walk away. So, he did what he had to do. With the help of his friend, he gathered everything they had uncovered. The evidence, the testimonies, the undeniable proof of the corruption that had been festering for years. It wasn't enough to just expose a single officer. It wasn't enough to just take down one piece of the puzzle. He had to take the whole system down. The night before he planned to release everything, he found himself standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The man he saw was different from the one who had first confronted the officer about his stolen car. He had changed. His purpose had changed. The fear that had once gripped him was now replaced by a quiet determination. He wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, he walked into the heart of the city, his hand steady, his resolve firm. With every step he took, he knew he was about to make a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. The truth would be revealed, no matter what the consequences. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with reactions, and soon, the whole city was talking about the corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. The officer, along with many others, was arrested, their ties to the underground network exposed for all to see. It wasn't easy. There were threats, there were risks, but the more he thought about the people whose lives had been destroyed by these hidden forces, the more he knew he had done the right thing. He had exposed a truth that needed to be heard, no matter how uncomfortable it made the powerful people in charge. And yet, in the aftermath, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one chapter in a much larger story. The network was gone, but the influence it had over the city, the control it had over its people, wouldn't disappear overnight. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But in that moment, as he stood in the center of the chaos he had helped ignite, he realized something crucial. He had changed the course of his own life. He had chosen to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And as the world around him began to take notice, he knew that this was only the beginning of something bigger than himself. He had found the truth, not just about the corruption that had plagued his city, but about his own capacity to stand up, to resist, and to demand justice. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about finding the courage to speak out, to make a difference. And that was a story worth telling. As he walked away from the center of the storm he had set into motion, the weight that had once burdened him felt lighter. The truth, as messy and complicated as it had been, had finally come to the surface. And in the end, that was all that mattered.